In the mid-1990s, there was a long-standing war between Serbian forces and the Kosovan rebels under the Kosovo Liberation Army. The Federal Army of the erstwhile Yugoslavia was accused of carrying out ethnic cleansing by chasing out tens of thousands of Kosovan Albanians. Many of them were Muslims. It went on for more than 4 years, from 1995 all the way to 1999. Eventually, NATO had to intervene in March of 1999 in an aerial bombardment of Kosovo as well as other Serbian-controlled cities and towns. Thousands died. It led to a mass exodus of refugees. Upwards of 1 million Kosovan Albanians had to flee. And what was even more controversial was that the NATO action back then, the aerial bombardment, was not authorized by the United Nations Security Council. It was a unilateral action, but it was marked as a humanitarian gesture to stop the ethnic cleansing of Kosovan Albanians. Eventually, the war ended sometime in 1999, and the then Yugoslav leader Slobodan Milosevic stood trial for war crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal. The trial ended without a verdict in 2006 when he died in his prison cell. All through this war, the Serbs versus the Kosovan Albanians, the Russian leaders at that time, first Boris Yeltsin and then subsequently Vladimir Putin, had stood by the Serbian government and their people. That is a fact that's not been forgotten even to this day. And that is now posing its own challenges for countries like Serbia and even Hungary to an extent, which are on the periphery of Russia but not quite on the same page as the West when it comes to dealing with Vladimir Putin and his special military operation in Ukraine. On Crux Decode, how Vladimir Putin's war is changing the dynamics from Belgrade to Budapest. Now, part of Vladimir Putin's allure lies in his image as a strong man. Now, this is an appealing model for neighbors like Serbia and Hungary. There too, there are autocratic long-time leaders, Serbian President Aleksandar Vucic, and the Prime Minister, and some would call an illiberal leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban. Now, both Vucic and Orban recently ran election campaigns primarily on a pro-Russia, pro-Putin plank. They denounced NATO action as well as Ukraine's actions in the lead-up to this war. In fact, surprisingly, both Vucic and Orban won the elections by record margins. Both in Serbia and in Hungary, there's also the connection of the Orthodox Church. Both countries are seen as fellow Slavic and Orthodox Christian countries for whom Russia has been an unwavering friend and a protector down the centuries. But perhaps most important is Putin's role as a lodestar for these countries. They also paint an aggressive history of themselves as being victims or sufferers and not aggressors. In fact, the politics and the psyche in most of these countries, it revolves around cults of victimhood. Now, these perceived notions of victimhood have been nurtured by resentment and grievance against the West, and in particular against America, for many years now. Societies which have suffered trauma, they develop some sort of a collective victimhood mentality, which is then used as a shield against their own crimes. Now, the same stories of suffering, they're repeated over and over again from one generation to the next till it becomes a believed reality. Now, this sense of victimhood runs very deep in Serbia. Even today, 20 years after the war in Kosovo, with all its ethnic crimes and the cleansing, the war there is viewed as a defensive response to the suffering imposed on the Serbian people by both NATO and the West. It is a bit similar to Vladimir Putin presenting his invasion of Ukraine as a righteous effort to protect ethnic Russians who belong to the Ruski Mir, or the Russian world. Now, the Ruski Mir is a mirror image of what the Serb nationalists call the Greater Serbia. But the Serbian government is wanting to walk that fine line between Russia and competing interests and demands from the West. On the one hand, the Serbian government is aware of the widespread public sympathy that there is for Russia, but at the same time, it does not want to burn bridges with the West. In fact, Serbia's President Aleksandar Vucic, for years now, he's tried to balance maintaining strong diplomatic and economic ties with Russia and at the same time keep the Western embrace going, because his government, more than any other in the last 20 years, has been pitching very hard for full membership of the European Union. Serbia is almost entirely dependent on Russian gas, while its army maintains ties with the Russian military. Although Serbia backed two United Nations resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one thing Serbia refused to do is to go along and impose sanctions on Moscow, much like many other Western countries have done. The Kremlin also supports Belgrade's opposition to the independence of Kosovo, and they do that by blocking its membership to the United Nations. Remember, Russia is a permanent member, it has a veto, and it's used this veto to placate and please the Serbian leadership. Now, because of the trauma around NATO's bombings from more than 20 years ago, most Serbs view whatever is wrong happening in the world as America's fault. So today, there is even greater resentment at how the world is shedding copious tears for the Ukrainians who've been killed in the war, but none for those Serbs who died in NATO's bombing of Kosovo back in the 1990s. Hungary, on the other hand, is allied with the losing side in both the world wars, both in World War I as well as in World War II. It was allied with the Nazi and Italian sides at that time. Now, Hungary too has an oversized victim complex, and it is rooted in losing large chunks of territory over the years. Hungary lost territory both in World War I as well as in World War II. It has lost territory to the erstwhile Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. It's also lost territory to the likes of Romania and Austria. All of this are byproducts of the two wars. Viktor Orban, the longtime leader of Hungary, he's been in power for more than 10 years now, he has amply stoked these resentments of ordinary Hungarians, appealing to what many call a more nativist sense of victimhood. In fact, Orban too has often sided with Russia over Ukraine, not just now in the current war that's going on in 2022, but also in the Russian annexation of Crimea that happened in 2014. Orban, much like Vladimir Putin, has also presented himself as some kind of a protector of ethnic Hungarians, especially those who live beyond Hungary's borders. Now, one thing is clear, that Vladimir Putin's war, though it's been viewed sympathetically in both Belgrade and in Budapest, it is also forcing its leaders to walk a fine balance. On the one hand, the need to keep an anti-Western sentiment is very much alive, and at the same time, they also have to ensure that the same West and the same NATO guarantees their economic and security needs. It is clear that both these leaders are happy to economically integrate more and more with Europe. Like, for example, Hungary is a full-fledged member of the European Union. You have Serbia, which is applying and is seeking to be a full-fledged member of the European Union, but they do not at the same time want to bear the wrath of Putin's anger. Now, only time will tell how long these leaders can keep up the charade and not fall off the tightrope.